Hi folks, welcome to today's webinar. My name's Paul Doyle. I'm the General Manager of Rail Freight and Ports with the Australasian Railway Association. Got a really exciting one for you today. Nicole Lockwood, who's the Chair of the Westport Taskforce, is going to be presenting on Westport, which is really an industry-leading freight planning exercise looking at how to manage the growing demand of freight in Western Australia over the next 50 years. So stay tuned for that. There's plenty of exciting stuff that we're going to talk about today. If we just flick to the slide on the protocols for today, I guess just so everyone's aware of some of the housekeeping, you have the ability to ask a question at any stage. You just need to click on the dark blue button and we will endeavour to run through some questions at the end of Nicole's presentation, so I encourage you to do that. Also, if you want to download some of the information, click on the light blue button that says download resources. You can also change the screen position as well, so have a look at that. You can click it into a square and make it larger as well, or you can see the slides and the presentation side by side. So all of that's available to you for those that are logged in. But with the housekeeping out of the way, I'll hand over to Nicole now. The virtual floor is yours, Nicole.
Thanks so much, Paul, and thanks to the ARA for the opportunity to engaging the traditional owners on the lands of all the places we're meeting. We're coming all around the country, so always want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. To be able to interact with Westport, it's been a very long journey, but important process to go through to understand the capability of WA's freight supply chains, and then I suppose what we need to grow into the future. If we just click forward, the first slide really in terms of the content is around our objectives. We're trying to understand what we needed to make sure that Perth and its surrounds could grow for the next 50 years and beyond, to make sure that we had sufficient capacity in port, road, rail and intermodal land. Looking at this system probably for the first time as a whole system, as a supply chain. And I think that's one of the limitations of many port planning exercises, is that it really looks to the port itself, but forgets that actually the strength of its supply chain is only as strong as the weakest link, which is often in other parts of the network. In doing this, we were given the opportunity to bring people to the table. Again, quite a unique opportunity. As we would all know well in this industry, most of what happens in the freight sector actually is run by the private sector, not government. So making sure that the private sector had the ability to engage with the process, making sure they were at the table to understand the impacts, and also to draw on, I suppose, the expertise that exists around the future thinking that's going on around the world. We came at it from a triple bottom line approach. So again, any new infrastructure has an impact on surrounding communities, and ultimately all of our supply chains are around either livability or creating jobs and prosperity. So making sure that people understood what that meant, and also understanding what the impact on their lifestyles was going to be. Clearly the economic picture was critical to work out how we're going to make sure that this is the most efficient and effective outcome, and provides the best outcome in terms of jobs and productivity for the state. And for us, new facilities always mean an impact on the environment. So how can we improve what we have? But in creating something new, how do we manage that impact? And I'll talk through that in a little bit. So it really was about understanding what we had and then looking forward and thinking about, I suppose, some of the trends that are emerging in terms of our supply chains. So just moving to the next slide in terms of timing, really to understand what was going on, we had to really look backwards a bit and sort of come to grips with the work that's been done in the past. And we've mapped 8 different cycles of port planning that's been done in WA. Unfortunately, none of them ever got to the point where there was a decision made and next steps taken. So we were pretty keen to make sure that this wasn't a 9th iteration of the same exercise. But in doing that, we really needed to come to grips with all of those supply chain elements. Looking at the road network, which very much was one of the major capacity restrictions for the port. Any of you who know Freo will understand that we're really fed by a couple of main arteries, none of which are sort of freeway standard. They're all sort of local and, I suppose, regional routes for largely, urban and commercial purposes. They wind their way through suburbia to get to our port. So really understanding that there was a significant investment required in the road network, Also in the rail network, and I'll talk through rail in a bit more detail shortly, but really looking at a very historic line which winds its way through the historic town of Fremantle. Fantastic tourist precinct, but doesn't really complement that sort of, going down for fish and chips on the foreshore whilst a 60 container freight train comes through the middle. So there's a few issues there over time as those capacities increase, and obviously we're trying to grow that facility. So when we looked at what does it cost to keep what we have and even just incrementally grow, we realised pretty quickly that it's a significant dollar figure. So doing nothing is not a low or a no cost option. In fact, doing nothing becomes very expensive. And that was a really interesting point in the community conversation, because there's a lot of connection with Fremantle Port and a lot of history, and a lot of people wanting to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere. So really getting some clarity around what doing nothing looks like, I think, was really important. So moving forward, the process then was really around looking at all the ways we could solve the problem. So the next slide really focuses on, we started actually with 25 options. We had 3 locations at Bunbury, which is to the south of the Perth city, about sort of 200 k's. And that's got a facility there which is focused around bulk, but we thought, right, there's some capacity. Perhaps we could do a complementary service down in Bunbury and something in Fremantle. So we had Bunbury as an option. We had Kwinana, which has always been the touted alternative to Fremantle. It currently houses all of our bulk facilities for the metro area and has space to grow, and then Fremantle. And as a result of looking at those 25, we came down to a short list of 7. Which were a combination of standalone port options in Kwinana and shared port options with Fremantle. Bunbury fell away as an option because basically we have a layer of basalt that sits at about 14 metres below the surface, which is very obviously expensive and difficult to remove and would have a significant environmental impact. Aside from the fact population-wise, Perth is very much still city-focused, and really it's quite a long time frame to be able to get the goods to balance up in terms of where they're going in. So taking them through Bunbury and back to Perth would have been a significant supply chain cost. So gone through that list of 7 down to now we're at 2 preferred options, which are just going through government at the moment. So if I just move forward to the next slide around the freight route opportunity, this is really focused on road specifically. So what the opportunity that presented with Kwinana was to get out of that inner urban area to, I suppose, create some separation between the freight task and the passenger task. And the freight routes that we looked at down at Kwinana offered that, and one in particular, Ankertel Road, allows us to take the freight from the port gate all the way through to Tonkin Highway, which is a major north-south connection, and allows really a ring road to run the whole way around the metro area to then distribute through to intermodal. So I suppose the investigation bore out that we have a really good route there. There are some issues already, though, with urban encroachment because long-term planning hasn't secured that corridor well. So one of the first steps in the next stage of planning is to make sure that that corridor is protected and that the right buffers are put in place to ensure that freight route can continue over time. But that's really the strongest of the options we looked at for moving the freight out of a Kwinana located port. If we just move to the next one around urban encroachment, there's a photo there which shows you, I suppose, how close the rail line in Fremantle comes to the historic buildings. And there's a couple of others in the next slide. And I think what we really came to grips with is that we are working with a historic facility, made a lot of sense at the time. They were working with what they had. But when we looked at the long-term opportunities for Fremantle, we actually sort of had a good look at rail and said, right, if we really want to grow the rail network into Fremantle, what does that look like and what steps do we need to take? And there were some constraint points identified early. The first one is actually the bridge that crosses the river between Fremantle and the port is shared by the passenger rail as well as the freight rail. So in peak periods, basically they're not allowed to, the freight trains are not allowed to access that bridge, which means that you've got multiple hours in both the morning and the afternoon peak where you've basically got no freight trains coming in. So one of the first opportunities was to create a separate bridge, and that's being worked through at the moment, and that's actually a committed and funded project by government, which will allow a dedicated freight path, which is great. So obviously from a capacity point of view, that provides some more pathways. But other than that, once we sort of separated that issue, the next part was, okay, well, how do we actually up the scale? So we've got some issues around the actual interface at the port and the rail terminal. So there would have been some upgrades required there. But really, to get volume in, you needed to duplicate the line. And if you can see on that photograph, there's really no space to duplicate that line where it is. So we looked at an option of basically a cut and cover, sort of a tunnel option where we dropped the line down about 9 metres, and it would have sat under the ground in dual track and would have allowed us to bring, I suppose, rail in and out underneath. But what that would have meant is a very significant investment underneath the historic town of Fremantle, at potentially some great risk to the historic buildings in terms of impact, and also the complexity of dealing with a very high water table at that point. The difficulty of having to cross the river meant that we couldn't get down low enough to get underneath it, so we had to still bring it back up and go across the river on a bridge. So it became a very complex project, and we did scope it out to understand it, but very quickly realised that the benefit that we got from that investment was probably not commensurate with the cost and the potential impact. So that fell away as a long-term option. So really what we're looking at for Fremantle is using what we already have, finding better ways to manage the pathways, and yeah, really, I suppose, extracting the value while we can. The other issue we have in that corridor is the tight curves. So we've got, again, historic footprint, number of tight curves that create very high pitch squeal and very slow speeds, because you've got a lot of interface coming through in terms of other vehicles needing to cross that railway line. So I think in terms of an optimum solution, it certainly wasn't that, and it's about trying to find other alternatives. So just going to the next slide, in terms of, I suppose, getting the balance right between increasing capacity and using other parts of the network, we needed to make sure that we could really think about that complementary or non-complementary land uses. We've got a lot of, as a number of major cities do, we've got a high growth population target, and looking at some of the density that's coming in around the rail corridor is a real concern, because again, planning hasn't necessarily got ahead of that. So thinking about how we manage those competing uses and to ensure we don't create problems for ourselves going forward. Just in terms of the assumptions we used on rail for this process, on the next slide, basically all of our options looked for 30% rail mode share. At the moment, we're sitting between 19 and 24%, depending on the month, which is up quite a bit from when this government came in at about 15 to 16%. But as others would know in other jurisdictions, getting the mode share up isn't easy. We have a rail subsidy in place to do that, at $50 a box, which is significant. And there's anecdotes from other parts of the sector that are saying that that even isn't sufficient to make it competitive. So it's a real question we've got to talk to government about at the moment. Is this a long-term solution? I talked you through the Swan River crossing. So that's the duplication of the bridge to create a dedicated freight rail path. Some of the other projects we're looking at as part of the rail upgrades in this is a rail loop upgrade, which is basically in Kwinana, where the current bulk facilities are. We've got the CDH terminal, which is our major grain handler, and a number of other exporters, Alcoa and a few others. They all use that one area, and there's quite a lot of constraint at the moment in terms of them accessing that. So we're looking to an improved loop down there to improve the bulk, which will also then create capacity for containers. And then we've got a number of other, we're going to create some passing loops and also some additional sidings to ensure that we've got more capacity on the current rail. But the reality is we actually are using what we already have. We're not building a brand new dedicated rail line. We did look at creating a dedicated path down the Ankertel freight route, so put trucks in one section and rail in another. But the thing we started to come to grips with is the trends that are happening around the future of the road industry, and also automation, and what that's going to mean in terms of individual containers potentially being able to go on trailers and go off straight to their destination rather than going to hubs. So when we looked at the cost of dedicating a whole other path just to rail, we really started to question whether that was the right answer. And we also had to look at the space we had, so it was about balancing that up. But that's something we can discuss in a bit more detail, because there was quite a lot to think about in terms of the future of rail for an inner urban intermodal task. So just to take you through the last parts of the process, the next slide's really around the breadth of things we had to consider when looking at our options. This was we ran what we called a multi-criteria analysis, which is a process you use when you have a number of different factors to assess over a number of different footprints and locations. It's trying to come up with a matrix, I suppose, to inform decision making. And you can see on there we ran some surveys Environmental values and social amenity were really high on the list of things people were concerned about. Some of the commercial aspects, obviously this is coming from the community, were not so high, but it really did mean that we had to make sure that those issues were well covered as part of our work. So as part of the assessment process, if we go to the next slide, the MCA2 weightings. Basically the way this works is each option you score against a series of criteria, and those criteria can be weighted. So we had two different multi-criteria assessment processes. The first one to take the 25 options down to the 7, and the second one to take the 7 down to 2. In the second round of multi-criteria assessment, you can see the proportion there. It's probably a little bit small, but it was a significant proportion, nearly a third, was based around environmental social values. And that was important because the location we're looking at is a very sensitive ecosystem down in Kwinana, which has a lot of unique megafauna and other species that need to be protected. So it's a balancing act that we had to make. Interestingly, the options that we've come up with didn't change at the top end. The first few, 3 or 4, didn't move, didn't matter how we, so we actually did a sensitivity analysis on the weightings, and we turned some of them up and turned them down. It didn't change the order of the ranking. So that gave us confidence that we'd come up with the strongest options no matter what the outcome. Just a last little piece on the environmental side. So just moving forward onto the next slide around Clovelly Sound. You can see on the right-hand side there a long list of different values that we identified in Clovelly Sound. As I said, it's already an industrial area and we already have our bulk facilities there. And you can see on the left-hand side of that graphic is Garden Island. That's where our current naval defence base is. So there's a lot of activity already happening there. But this is a very important marine going forward, is that all of those values are protected. And to be honest, we probably also need to enhance the quality of that system to be able to have the resilience to be able to build anything new. Environmental approval in this is going to be the most complex part of the process, and we've got a very engaged department and EPA, but it's certainly not a given that that will be a done deal. So, and we've got a very engaged community that have got very strong views about how they want to use that area. So it'll be one to watch, that's for sure. So just moving forward, the second last slide there around our progress update. So we've now completed all of our technical work. We've submitted our recommendations to government. They are in the process at the moment of considering those, and obviously COVID has created some delays around that. We expected a decision early this year, but that's been set back a little, but still definitely in discussion and consideration by government at the moment. And shortly we should have a decision and an announcement. However, behind the scenes, as you can see, it's a massive project. A lot of work still to do and a lot of scoping happening at the moment about what comes next. So just onto the last slide there, the focus for the next stage is really understanding all the risks and knowledge gaps. So through the first 2 stages of the project, we actually identified a range of strategic risks, and they range from the environmental approval process to a number of the areas we want to move through have state agreements across them, which impact individual landowners, as well as a range of different planning issues that we need to work through. So they'll be sort of top of mind for the first part of the next stage. We really need to do some more work around the supply chain capacity of Fremantle. The road in particular is a very flexible beast. Depending on how you use it and when you use it, you can get a lot more out of it. And again, COVID painted a very interesting picture of how congestion changes when our behaviour changes. So, people will say that Fremantle road networks are very congested and problematic. I think we've just demonstrated to ourselves if a few of us work from home and we don't send our kids to school all at the same time, we've actually got a fair bit more capacity than we thought. And then there's the question of how much can we use out of hours, and there's a whole opportunity there. That requires some market intervention and probably some incentivisation from government. So there's a question there for government about how active they want to get in the market. And that'll be the same with rail. So we've really got to consider the subsidy, how it's working or not, and what government wants to do in terms of its policy position around rail. We know that the social benefit of getting goods off the roads is high, but there's also some social impact of noise and impact along the freight corridor of those that live adjacent to the rail line. So it's a balancing act. And then we move into a transition plan. So the options we've come up with have some timings associated with them, but they're based against a series of assumptions, all of which may change, or maybe government might decide on some things that will alter them. So some planning around those. Looking at the corridor protection, as I discussed, so those changes to road and rail corridors that we want to make, let's put them in the planning system. get on with the environmental assessment and the monitoring, and then get into the detailed design and engineering for the port itself and all the associated connections. The next stage will involve a detailed business case, as well as the environmental approval and the planning changes. And throughout the whole process, we will definitely be continuing to engage with industry and the community to make sure that we understand how any of these changes are going to impact them. So that's the work we've done to date. There's a number of angles to this we can have a chat about. So, yeah, happy to take questions. And back to you, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. Look, there are some questions that have come in, and I guess one of the ones that I'm particularly keen to sort of have a chat about is that I guess some of the findings might actually challenge our notion around, the role of container freight in urban areas. I guess, what do you see coming out of these studies that others potentially can learn from in that space?
So, look, it's not something we've formed a final conclusion on, but certainly the people we've had involved, and we've had ARC Infrastructure who run our rail network and a number of operators involved, as well as our project director who's got a long history in rail. We've had a lot of discussions about what is the role of rail going forward. And particularly in a market like Western Australia or Perth that isn't overly big and is quite small in terms of distance, are we really well served by putting everything on a train to move it 20 kilometres, to take it off a train, to put it on a truck, to move it another 15 kilometres or 20 kilometres? Is that really the answer for what we need, particularly when our rail network winds its way through suburbia, creating other issues and at such low speeds? So the benefit of being off-road is there, and there's definitely something to be argued about that. But because the distances are so small and the volumes really aren't that high, is the economics right? And I think that's something we're thinking about more broadly. There's a question, obviously, about long distance and about bulk and about other parts of the rail network that are very different than this. But we're very much focused around this question of container movement in a city. Is that the answer? And I think the thing that none of us have yet sort of come to grips with is what is the future of automated road transport? And if we end up with automated trailers that basically can go from the port gate to destination in one step with low impact and fairly high community acceptance, then is that actually a better answer than putting everything on a train to move it to another destination to have to move it again? And I don't think we haven't landed it finally, but I think it's something that probably a number of metros, and I think there'll be policy to be debated around this. Governments will have a view on how much they want rail to be part of the solution. But I think for operators and government thinking about the economics of the equation, what is rail? Where does rail add value versus where is there another way? The other part to this is we've got corridors. So if rail isn't the answer for the inner urban area, can we transform those corridors for still movement of freight, but maybe on something different? Maybe it doesn't look like a train. It looks like something that can separate and split off along the network as it gets to its destination. So I think that it's not a short-term question, but I think it's definitely something we need to think about in a lot more depth.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I guess it's about understanding where rail's strengths are and where it can deliver and where it can't deliver. And I guess the sort of work that ARA do is in those areas where it very much is, able to, take some of that additional freight, and there is an opportunity to have that modal shift. Do we have a regulatory environment that encourages that sort of competitive neutrality that we'd like to see? And I guess that just leads into the next question, which is really around, for your project, are there things at a national level in the policy space that need to be put in place, or are in the process of being put in place, that will sort of support the work that you're doing at Westport?
Look, I think the National Freight Supply Chain Strategy is a good step, trying to get some collective views on some of these issues across boundaries is helpful. I think the other part, we are still very reliant on east-west movement from the East Coast. If we had a system, I know that there's a lot of conversations going on about signalling and improvements to the efficiency of the whole network nationally. Some of those opportunities would help the outcome locally. So if we had a better national approach to some of these opportunities and they happen sooner. You only ask these questions when things aren't working well. If they're working well, you tend to just push on and keep going. I think the more we not break the system, but the more we don't enable the system to be its best, then it's going to mean we make different local decisions. So I think where there's, we've already got, a lot of, and we've seen the shift through COVID of modes when, certain economics are not making sense or certain systems are broken, like the aviation system, we see the movement. So how do we make sure that we're leveraging off the best of what the rail service has to offer and keeping it moving? Because I think the other thing I'm really challenged by is when you look at rail as a mode, and you look back 50 to 100 years, and maybe people will have a crack at me for this, but it doesn't seem to have changed a lot in terms of how it does what it does. And technology is a part of that. And I think certainly some of the infrastructure we still see on our rail network is certainly not new, and it's not bringing to life the best of what's available. So I think to the extent we can, have a better national conversation about the opportunities to keep evolving rail and making it cutting edge and making it, in terms of impact and other things, the best it can be, then we've got a better chance locally of keeping it viable.
Yeah, look, and I think that's a good point, and I think there's some encouraging signs in terms of some of the recent announcements that have been made. So announcement from the DPM around rolling out ATMS, and I think some of those interoperability issues that will also be captured as part of the National Rail Action Plan. There's definitely a willingness on behalf of industry, I think, to really to really step up. I guess there's also opportunities, as you said, in terms of some of those policy levers around the national freight and supply chain strategy that we can pull to sort of realise some of these benefits. I guess from your perspective, do you see opportunities for the rail sector in the freight space to be working together more effectively to improve productivity? And if so, what do those look like?
Look, definitely. And again, COVID's presented an interesting opportunity through the Freight Logistics Council that I chair. I've never before seen every mode being willing to work together. So we've seen, air, road, rail and sea all in the room talking about, the stresses and challenges and opportunities that come out of a situation like that. And again, we've had working groups in the rail space before on different issues, particularly around noise and impact, and making sure that that the sector's doing as much as it can to be on the front foot, so we don't end up in the situation that New South Wales found themselves in, where they had to react to community sentiment. We wanted to sort of be proactive on that. So there's always, in our jurisdiction, there's been a willingness to get around the table and talk, but again, COVID gave us a chance to push that and say, okay, that's fine for just, well, I'm happy to do this, you're happy to do that, but what can we do together to actually help each other to take, because even though it's a competitive market, if the fundamentals are not working, then everyone loses. So how can we work collectively to improve some of those factors? And we were talking about all sorts of things like driver sharing, and when we were really concerned about the risk of COVID, things were put on the table that never had been willing to be discussed before, and how can companies work together. So I think, again, let's not lose that window we've had of willingness to collaborate, and let's look at the big picture and what we're trying to achieve. And the long-term future of the sector is very much about how everyone can help each other step up. And I think the opportunities are really significant.
Yeah, look, I agree entirely, and I guess we're looking to hold our own sort of rail freight productivity workshop, which thankfully you'll be coming along to on Friday, where I think that's part of the conversation that we want to start to generate amongst ARA and its members. Because, I think there's definitely opportunity at both ends. There's opportunities for us to better outline and articulate the benefits of rail freight. We do our value of rail report that we've done quite a bit, and we're updating that. And it'll have lots of these good metrics about the benefits of rail, but going a step further and actually sort of providing some advice and guidance to government around how you can embed those sort of positive externalities into policy, into investment decisions. But at the same time, as you pointed out, there's a parallel role for the sector to demonstrate that it's not just relying on government to help. It's actually working together to deliver some things as well. So I think there'll be some interesting conversations about some of that stuff, but definitely COVID has presented some opportunities for us, that's for sure. Speaking of the border restrictions in WA, slightly a left field sort of question, but I guess we've had some question from a number of our members just in terms of how that's changed the dynamics of freight movements in WA.
Yeah, look, significantly. So obviously I found out about 3 days before the government wanted to put it in place that they wanted to close the borders, and we set about running around like mad things over a weekend to work out how you do that. And then we're involved in some design work around, the app we've got in place and all that, which is all great. But what no one knew is, we knew why we wanted to do it, and we knew the need, but what would that mean? And I think it was the correlation of the biggest shift I think that's happened is probably, well, it's been so many things, and some of them have been unconnected. So the price of fuel happening, a drop in the price of fuel happening at the same time as the aviation sector basically fell off a cliff. At the same time, you've got border closures, made for a very interesting interplay. And I think so. We saw, what was air freight moving some of that to rail, some of it to road. We saw road stealing from rail because the price of fuel was so cheap that suddenly the road task became quite, an efficient process. And we definitely had some issues with our border closures, and we definitely had some people pretty annoyed. But on the whole, the understanding was that freight would keep moving, and the police did their best to ensure that happened. So we didn't sort of see as a sector a need to close everything down and reopen. It was largely just adapting to a changing environment. It was more around what customers chose to do with their freight and what the availability was of services. And I think the East-West connection certainly saw a significant uptick both around food and then around Australia Post, and then probably a range of other goods that needed to be moved quickly. So I think, it was fantastic to see everyone pivot quickly and grab the opportunity. But what's been equally interesting is that it hasn't stuck. Things have moved again. So it's not necessarily a systemic change at this point, but depending particularly how air freight goes, we're going to have to see some pretty big shifts, I think, to sustain that over a 6 to 12 month period until that restores. And this question of the sort of the economics between road and rail is always going to plague us because of the difference in the systems and the fact we don't have road user charging and that they're not equivalent. You're not paying the same amount to be on a freight line on a train as you are on a truck. So it's an uneven base to start with, and that's something I think governments need to be willing to deal with.
Yeah, and that's long been our position that, as I said before, competitive neutrality. There's opportunities, I guess, with the heavy vehicle road reform that's happening, and that's certainly going to be a role that ARA are going to play to really sort of push for some of that. Equality and fairness around the regulation. I guess just you mentioned before in terms of the role of technology and automation, and I guess I hear that a little bit that, I guess road sector is moving fairly rapidly with technology and automation. Can rail keep up? That sort of, I guess that bothers me a little bit sometimes because I think there is an opportunity for rail to, to very much play a role in that space. I guess what can rail better do to embrace sort of technology, do you think?
So there's a couple of things. And some of it's not technology in the form of digital. It's actually more in terms of, engineering, design, innovation type technology. And I think it's both. So, when we did our sort of detailed work on the impact side, so looking at rail noise, we did a lot of testing and understanding of what the causes are. And I think, there are a lot of new methods coming out of other parts of the world around, rail dampers and wheel, whether it's wetting agents or all sorts of different things that I think we just need to keep having the conversations and being part of looking at best practice, because there are parts of the world where people will say, well, it's a freight train, it's got my food on it. If it squeals its head off, then tough, because it's getting me what I need. And there's some communities in the world that are more happy than that. And I think through this period, we've probably got more social license than we've ever had. So there's definitely something to work on with that. But I think everyone's expectation, doesn't matter what industry you're in, is that impact is actually going to decrease over time. I think everyone's expecting higher environmental standards. They're expecting better quality of everything. And that's just community sentiment. So I think it starts with what we have now. So does the current network work the most effectively it can? And that is largely around how it, from a maintenance point of view, but also from a community impact, and that's noise, emissions, all that sort of thing. If you then, so you've worked with what you've got, you can only do what you can with the current network. Then it's about, well, what technology and what new, I suppose, engineering do you bring into your locos? So I think, as I said, we've got, a mix of stock in WA, and I'm sure everyone does. We're not seeing the same sort of upscaling of the fleet in rail as we are in road. We're seeing a lot of, new and different type of vehicles entering the road market, and I think people again see that as a positive. They're seeing, better emissions targets. They're seeing, quite a whether it's for road, obviously it's braking or whatever, and even just the sound of the engine. So those sorts of improvements, I think there's a constant demand for continuous improvement. And then there's the system side, which is how do we ensure that we are using the network to its greatest advantage and at its highest capacity. So that's around the signalling and that type of thing. And again, that's probably more relevant in high productivity areas, not so much long distance, but it definitely is about squeezing the asset and making the most out of it. So I think it's also, I'm in a few sectors where it's that, disrupt yourself or risk being disrupted. My sense of the conversations I have in the rail space is there's a little bit of complacency still that, we're kind of, this is our game, we've done it like this forever, we'll be fine. I don't see that same hunger for improvement and drive to disrupt yourselves before, another mode comes to take your share or before another operator decides they've got a better way. And I think that appetite needs to start to build, otherwise others will take that share.
Yeah, no, a fair point, well made, and something that I've certainly also observed. Maybe just going on to the multi-criteria process, because I think you talked a little bit there about the process that you went through, and I particularly like the sensitivity analysis stuff that you talked about as well, because often people will be very much set on these are my values, and I'm not going to shift on those values. If I can't see that my values have been sort of incorporated into that process, then I'm going to be sceptical of the process. How did you go in terms of the community's acceptance of the process that you went through? Sometimes they won't necessarily accept the outcome, but were they happy with the process?
Well, I think, to be honest, it was mixed. So I think for those who came to the table objectively, wanting to engage, were very impressed and liked the dimensions we looked at, liked the breadth of the work we did, and thought the fact that we tested it and retested it was reassuring. There were groups who came with a very clear agenda around the environment or around fishing or around unions and jobs, who just felt that it was a way to game the system. So, I think if you think someone is setting about an exercise with a preordained answer, then you're going to read everything the way you think it should be read to reinforce that belief. We're, post announcement, we're happy to open our books to whoever wants to have a look at what we've done, to show them how we've done it. And the thing I was pleased about was that our team came to this task with no kind of history in it and no agenda around what the answer should be. We just wanted to find the most robust answer. So I think, I think the process is as good a process as you can do when you've got something so complex. I think it really does give weight to things like 30% of the criteria being around environment and social. That's huge. Like, I was on the board of Infrastructure Australia for 9 years, and I don't remember any project having that level of weight put to environment and social. So, people will always want more. There were some environmental groups that saw our community survey work that said 50% of people thought the environment was most important. So they wanted 50% allocated to the environment. So it doesn't work like that. That's just a sample, and we've got to make sure that the whole thing makes sense. So, you're never going to please everyone, but I think it's definitely brought a different way of thinking to the infrastructure planning debate, and I think people are going to expect more of it going forward.
Yeah, look, and I share that. Some of my experiences doing some port planning in on the east coast, on the doorstep of the Great Barrier Reef, you can never value environment high enough. And I think some of the other challenges also is that if you try and seek information from people and ask them what are the important values that that they want to see protected or that they want to see managed, you run the risk of having people say, well, I don't want to, I'm not giving you the answer. You need to give me the answer and tell me what it is that you're doing. And so, well, to know what the answer is, I need to know what's important to you so that I can factor it into that process. So it can be a bit of a challenging process, I guess. A couple more questions before we wrap it up. I guess I was interested in your comments just in relation to COVID and how that might change the way we do things and what that means in terms of the role of the freight sector and in particular, I guess the timing of how we actually do certain things. I wonder if you just sort of elaborate on that a little bit more. I guess during that period, we've been looking to push to, have curfews removed when there's been increased demand, actually get, more freight as an essential service to different areas. But I guess you're suggesting that going forward, the world's going to look a little bit differently. We're not probably all going to be rushing to work at the same time.
An opportunity government that's willing to be a bit creative and look at their whole planning and transport system as a system. It's not necessarily always about building more. It's about using what you have more effectively. So I think what we've done overnight is just demonstrate the opportunities that exist to rethink the way we use what we have. So for me, there's a couple of really great things that have come of this. As I said, for the last year and a half at the Freight Council, we've been working on this whole thing about a social licence campaign, trying to get the community to connect with the fact that freight is so important to their daily lives, and it's not a burden on them. It's actually something that enables the things that they're after. So I think we've been gifted that as part of this process, and never before has freight been discussed so much, and never before have truck drivers and train drivers and others been thanked so much for their role in the system. So I think let's not lose that visibility that we've created. That's a real opportunity for jobs and training as well. I think it's another part of our sector that's problematic. We've got an ageing workforce. We've got a lack of interest from the younger demographic in moving into the sector. What do the new jobs look like? And how do we make this sector appealing to the next wave of kids and young adults coming through? But I think too, it's really questioned our whole supply chain model and where we source our goods and how much reliance we have on various parts of the world and how resilient or not our system is physically and I suppose virtually in terms of the relationships. So I think the opportunity out of that is for Australia to pivot and to maybe reposition on some things that we used to do and have decided others do better and maybe build some new capability locally again. But I think it's also the question of resilience in supply chains and in infrastructure. We've always thought about climate change and floods and droughts and other things, but bushfires. But resilience in terms of a pandemic, I don't know that anyone had that in their plan. And I think what we've realised as part of this is it can mean all sorts of things, and we actually do really need to think about how we plan our cities and how we plan our connections, our routes, and how resilient are they when we really need them to, we did a lot of scenario planning through this period, and we've got an east-west connection on rail that goes down at least twice a year. We have some major catastrophe happen on it, whether it's an accident or something goes wrong, and we have no alternative. So what's the answer to that? And we had to plan for, hang on a minute, we've got a pandemic with an increased reliance, everyone's wanting food, everything, the volumes are as high as they've ever been. What happens if someone hits somebody on that route and it goes down for 2 weeks? Or, there's a derailment or whatever it is. There's no plan B. It's, okay, well, we put it all on road or we just wait until it's fixed. Well, maybe that is the answer, but let's do the work to make sure we're comfortable that is the answer. And let's not wait for another tragedy or bushfire or whatever. The bushfires, we already had enough bloody lessons learned out of that we haven't done anything with. So let's not waste these crises and not use the lessons to improve the system. And that's, I think, what we need to do next.
Yeah, most definitely. And capitalise early, as you say, while it's still fresh in people's mind around the importance of rail freight in particular. That brings me to my last question, because you just sort of touched on, some of the aspects around, training and skills and using this as an opportunity, I guess, to make rail an attractive sector. You got any thoughts on just where we are as a sector around training and skills, and where the opportunities are to potentially improve in that space.
Well, I think it goes to the earlier point about how much the sector is willing to disrupt itself, and it goes to the question of investment in technology and in new operating systems. No different than a truck, or or some of the remote operations that are happening on mine sites. If you're offering a young trainee an opportunity to sit in a 50-year-old cab that's not very exciting and fun and has no technology and is uncomfortable, I don't know that you're going to get much joy. If you ask them to sit in something that's got all the latest tech, that they can see the whole network, that they can potentially even do it remotely, this is just where the world's going. So whether or not the sector thinks that that's where it wants to go, that's fine. But I think getting skills, or is it that actually we don't need people in those roles anymore, and we're going to evolve those roles to something else that actually means that we can still run the service, but in a very different way. So I think it's going to require some reimagination of what the service looks like, along with some investment in some new kit, because that's going to be part of the value proposition. And then an early intervention with high school kids and other kids. It's not like there's not an excitement about the industry, and especially in small children. I think you could build something quite strong early if they could see what the future looked like. But it's also about the lifestyle they want to live. And for some people, a local service, fine, but anything that's going to take them away from home for long periods, what does that look like over time? And is that what we're offering? So, and I think the other is leveraging other sectors. We don't have the luxury of just being able to do what we want for our own people from stop. I think all people going forward are going to cycle through multiple careers in their lives. And if we don't have the ability to train them up so that they can pivot between different industries or different parts of the sector or different modes even, then it limits everyone's lifespan in terms of their opportunities.
Yeah, well said. I think that's it. We've done all the questions. I'm gonna let you get to your next webinar.
No worries. And I did see one about sharing the slides. More than happy for you to send them out to everyone.
Yeah, they'll come through as part of the pack that goes out to everyone. But yeah, thanks again for your time. Really
pleasure. Thank you.
Join us again next week for another webinar. But for now, bye. Thank you.